it's perfect timing because we're right on 1 o'clock in South Australia, which was the designated time. So I'll take this opportunity to say hello to our audience and to welcome our fabulous panel members here today. I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and First Nations people on the many lands that we meet today. And I'd like to recognise the elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to take this opportunity for all of us to send our heartfelt wishes for the clinicians and students amongst us who are having it rough at this time with COVID. So COVID has brought us together today to have this session on the virtual assessment, but it's also, causing significant impact on our health professional colleagues across the world. So I'd like to just take that time to send our heartfelt wishes to all those having a tough time. But today we're here to talk about virtual assessment, and we've certainly enjoyed preparing for this session. I'd like to take this, I'd like to just get everybody to introduce themselves with their name and where they're beaming in from today. So firstly, I'm Lucy Walters and I'm beaming in from Mount Gambier in Australia. Dale, can I hand over to you?
Hi, I'm Dale Song and I'm in Adelaide, Australia as well. And I'm from the Adelaide Royal Clinical School.
And Francois?
Hi, I'm Francois Coetzee. I'm calling in from Cape Town, actually Worcester, South Africa, which is in the Western Cape.
Fantastic. And Jill? You're on mute, Jill.
Sorry. I'm Jill Conkin and I'm calling in from Edmonton, Alberta. I'm at the University of Alberta, Canada.
Fantastic. And Abby, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Abby. I'm a fifth year medical student with the Uni of Adelaide and I'm currently based in Port Lincoln, which is in rural South Australia.
Fantastic. Julie?
Hi, I'm Julie Ash and I'm the assessment academic at the Adelaide Rural Clinical School with Lucy and Katrina and Abby and Dale, and great team.
And Katrina, can I get you to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Katrina Morgan and also with the Adelaide Rural Clinical School, and I'm based in the Barossa Valley, about an hour out of Adelaide in Australia.
Fantastic. And last and certainly not least, David, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hi, I'm David Gunn. I'm at the University of Wollongong. We're on the director of the rural program. I'm currently not in Wollongong. I'm in a small rural town in New South Wales doing some clinical work at the moment.
Fantastic, thank you. So today we might start just by thinking about assessment and its purposes. And Julie, I'd really like to hand over to you to get us starting to think about virtual or remote assessment.
Okay, so we start with the, can you see that? Yes?
Yeah.
We start with beautiful picture of rural South Australia, quite near to where Abby is located. And we're going to talk about the challenges and opportunities that have arisen for us with having to switch to online assessment, essentially. I sort of could preface this by saying that most CLICs, particularly the rural CLICs, are kind of got their heads around remote assessment, but it's the big assessments, often the big ones that they share with the schools, that are particularly challenging. And I think actually we've probably got something to offer for having had to think forward and creatively much more. What I wanted to talk, the way that this session will go is, obviously we know that Lucy Walters is a facilitator, and I'll be speaking to you about the transition to different ways of assessment. And you'll hear some vignettes from a number of people, from the student experience from Abby, about the clinical assessments from Francois and Jill and Katrina, and written assessments from David, and Dale Sung will add the educational IT, educational design perspective. So let's think about transitions and the challenges when we're in a pandemic such as we are. And in a sense, in terms of, this is a busy slide, I'm going to take you through it slowly, but I've watched all the presentations you're going to see, and many things came to my mind about adapting assessments. And, you know, really what came to mind is how when we adapt assessments, there's lots of cans and can'ts, but really what we have to do is challenge the assumptions. And what really comes through in a lot of the presentations is how important it is the context of your assessment, and in particular, the culture of assessment where you are, and the history and the practices that people take for granted but may not have actually questioned. And quite often they're based on tenets as much as they're based on any good sound science or anything like that. And what I've observed is that the COVID pandemic has basically said, well, we have to change. So you can't be naysayers. We've all got to go along with this. And so it's actually been a wonderful opportunity in that sense. But it's also meant we've all had to be quite fast in our feet, and really, for someone such as myself who is more on the assessment design side of things, it's about knowing when to push a little bit and challenge, you know, why do we do it this way? Why does the practice have to be that way? But there are other things that are really important in your assessment context. So there's the culture and the people and their practices. There's also the resources. And there are many sorts of resources, and many of them in CLICs we already have with great ICT communication technology. But and that really provides us what I've called affordances, which means affordances are when we are afforded to do something different, when we're afforded to be able to do something. And these vary in different places. So I've also put locale, because where you are located and the sorts of different locations, what they're afforded can be different. But then you need to think about your people, and I've called these effectivities, which means whatever you've been afforded, you know, wonderful online learning systems, can people actually use it? So that's what that means, you know, and what do we have to do to help people know how to use it and make this work, and make it work not just for the people who are having to deliver it, but for the students. And I have to say, I've been amazed how adaptable our students have been, and how we've watched what the students have done and gone, oh, there's a good idea. And on the other side of my screen, which I haven't really turned to, are the things that quite often we do think about. So the curriculum, but is there an opportunity to also again look at the alignment? Has our curriculum moved on, but our assessment hasn't? Is this a chance to bring them into alignment? The assessment purposes, is it a chance for us to rethink about learning purposes and certification purposes? And then, of course, in the assessment context, there is policy. So policy can be an enabler if we're in touch with the policymakers, but it also can be a barrier if everyone says, no, the committee says, no, we can't do this. And how do we go about challenging that? So I'll leave that there. I've painted a broad picture, but these are the things that came out of my observation of the presentations you're about to see. So I'll just leave that there and just finish with that. After this webinar, we'll be going to group discussions, and we want to share lessons learned, and we want to share wisdom. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Julie. And I love that you've been able to draw in all of the conversations that have come up before today. Please make sure if anybody wants to comment at any time that we engage in that conversation as we go along. But I did want to then, having set the scene so nicely, Julie, I did want to actually ask Abby to perhaps reflect on assessments from her perspective. Abby, you've had a crazy year. I don't know what you were expecting this year, but what you got isn't what you were expecting, I'm sure. That's made a significant impact on teaching, but particularly on assessments at this time. And I'm really keen to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy, and thanks, Julia, for those insights. I'm hoping you can see my PowerPoint. I will just start it properly. Yeah, so I'm Abby. I'm in my 5th year at the University of Adelaide, which is where we sit our final exams. And there's about, I think, 41 of us in the rural cohort. And before COVID, we all went off to our rural sites thinking it was going to be a completely normal year, and we're spread right across South Australia in various spots. So before COVID, we sort of had quite a set structure in terms of a mix of both online and in-person tutorials. So shared tutorials over Zoom platform throughout the week. And then we also were able to have weekly in-person tutorials with local general practitioners. And our assessment consisted mainly of a few online assignments and monthly formative online quizzes, which was through exam software. And then at the start, middle and end of the year, we had in-person week-long workshops, which is where we would do our practical assessment, like OSCEs and that sort of thing. So yeah, in terms of the written assessment, we were quite lucky that we'd already had a few months of having monthly formative quizzes to try out the exam software and be quite familiar with it. So it was sort of a seamless transition for us in that aspect to start doing multiple choice quiz exams on the same platform. So I think that was really helpful for us to already have tried it out under a low pressure environment to then undertake the exams on the same software. And I think it was a bit of a novelty for us doing the bring your own device, because we haven't really done that before, and it worked out quite well and probably reduced a lot of stress around our mid-year exams, being able to just go to your usual rural site and do it there, rather than normal where we would travel to another site and we'll meet as a large group and sit the exam together. So I think that was probably one positive, in that it made it a bit more of a relaxed environment. I guess maybe could be a positive or negative depending how you looked at it. And then in terms of the practical assessment, I've sort of just inserted a picture of what we're expected to do. I haven't actually recorded mine yet, but the way we're doing it now is we've sort of had these more modified OSCE scenarios where you are given cases to choose from, and then you get to select your own standardized patient. So maybe a friend or a family member, and then just record a consult in your own time. So it allows a lot more flexibility for us in terms of being able to complete that at a time when we're not feeling frazzled or stressed, and do it in our own time. So that's really exciting to try out for the first time this year. And it also allows for technical difficulties, as opposed to, say, if we were to do them all on one day via Zoom as live consults. So I think one of the downsides being that there's probably not as much of the element of surprise and sort of that anxiety, stress walking into a room to do an OSCE as you usually would, but I think it's a really exciting and creative approach to it. So yeah, I don't have too much more to say on the assessment, because I guess we haven't sat half of it yet, but so far we've had a really positive experience, and really looking forward to trying out the other sorts of things that are in store.
Abby, I'm just interested because, you know, when you started at the beginning of the year, the assessments were set, and you know, you came in with a particular expectation. I wonder if you could just talk briefly about, you know, how have you as a student group found the shifting sands where we're going, oh, well, we're not doing that anymore. We're doing something else, but we can't tell you quite what it is yet. This is what we're planning to do now. How have you, particularly as the student rep for this group of students, engaged in the discourse of and shaping what's to come?
Yeah, I think it was certainly difficult being our final year of exams. There's a lot of stress already existing. So it was difficult having that uncertainty, and particularly in sites, well, every site's very unique in your exposure to the different areas of medicine. So I think the main discourse was around not having enough exposure to be able to complete assessment tasks to their full extent. But I think there's been some good creativity around with our local site coordinators as well, helping organise us zooming into specialist visits and that sort of thing to assist with getting extra increased exposure to things like paediatrics or other specialties. But I think it was a little bit hard in terms of other assignments where you might have to do a write-up on a certain patient or that sort of thing, because you're not seeing patients in the same context that you might usually, and it's a lot more phone consult based sometimes. So it has been a little bit trickier in terms of finding patients for various cases. So a few of the assessments have had to be modified. For example, our obstetrics and gynecology case now has been modified to allow students to just more focus on a medical issue related to pregnancy rather than the patient journey as such. So I think there has been flexibility there that's been really helpful for those students that aren't able to fulfill the prior requirements that they may have been able to.
Thanks. So I'm thinking that there's been quite a lot of innovation, and some of that has been to adapt processes that have already occurred or already been quite innovative. Francois, you've had some really interesting experiences previously with the patient study assessment that you've then adapted. Can you tell us a bit about the context in which you work and then those assessments, please?
Sure, Lucy. Thank you for the opportunity. So I'm based in Worcester. I'll show you a map shortly. Here you go. Yeah, I'm not sure you, yeah, I think you can see that.
Yeah, so it's not Worcester, UK, obviously.
No, it's in South Africa. So I'm based in Worcester, and we've got an LIC of 13 students, and they are based in public hospitals. These are small hospitals of about 50 to 70 beds. And the students work alongside the doctors and are immersed in the clinical environments. So much of their learning is centered around patient encounters, and we expect students to develop a portfolio of patients. It's very similar to a panel of patients of about 8 to 10 patients per clinical domain, those domains being internal medicine, surgery, etc. Yeah, last year we had students move to Uppington for the first time, which posed a bit of a distance, and since most of our examiners are either based in Worcester and the Tygerberg campus, we had to make use of video conferencing. So we trialed that out last year to use it for patient study assessments. And then our patient study assessments is basically an interview where we use a rubric, almost like a structured interview, but the rubric guides us in the types of questions we ask. And we use this to both test knowledge, but also clinical reasoning and insight in the management and diagnostic processes. And this typically lasts about an hour per student. And usually we did this face-to-face with our nearby sites. But with COVID-19 and the lockdown that was went with it, we couldn't do face-to-face anymore, and we had to do everything by video conferencing. So the previous experience helped us a bit with that. Having a few issues initially with the connectivity, we managed to sort that out, but that generally worked reasonably well. Here's just a photo with permission from the consultant and the student of what typically a conversation looks like. So here we have an orthopedic surgeon examining a student with me, and we have a patient summary of what the student sent beforehand to us. So we go through this patient summary that the student have written up and ask questions about how they came to that differential diagnosis, and then they have to justify it. And then in this particular examination, we asked a lot of questions about the management and the type of antibiotics one should use and the cover that you want for those antibiotics. This is then also followed up by a global assessment of all the other patients, where we ask questions from the 8 or 9 other patients that the student sent summaries to us. We then ask the student to log out for a short while when we have a patient sort of a marks discussion, and we decide on a consensus mark and the areas where the student needs feedback. We then send a message via WhatsApp to the student when we're ready, and then get the student to come back and give them some feedback on which areas was done well and where they can do even better. Yeah, so the transition has been relatively smooth in going to video conferencing, and since our assessment is very much based on a conversation, the video conference platform of Microsoft Teams allowed for that. The only issue we really encountered was students didn't always understand our mark allocation, since much of the previous assessments were MCQs, and that's prompted us now to write very clear descriptors of how we allocate marks and to deal with that component which the students didn't understand, because we had to explain to the students, if you do everything we expect, we're going to either give you a 6 or a 7 out of 10. But if you really surprise us and you know more than our interns, then we'll give you an 8 or a 9 or even a 10. But other than that, and some of the connectivity issues, this went relatively well for us.
That sounds amazing. Does anyone have any questions of Francois?
If the audience have questions, they can use the question and answer tool. If the attendees would like to ask a question, please type it in the question and answer box.
Francois, it sounds like that there's been some continuous quality improvement of this patient panel assessment, some of which is independent of it now being virtual. You know, it is learning what it is, or how students interpret the marks, and ensuring that you can increase the accountability of the marks that the students achieve. But there's also been some learnings from transferring it to virtual.
Yes, indeed. The students actually asked that we have an online meeting so that they can give us feedback and sort of get general feedback, which was very useful. And that has prompted us to rethink how we can do things better.
That's fantastic. And any particular learnings from that you'd like to share with us all?
We've realized that we have to give feedback written as well as oral. We initially thought oral feedback would be sufficient, but students also want written feedback. And as I said, the descriptors was an essential part of just being transparent about the process and how we allocate marks. Yes, we had one remark about being assessed by people of similar profile, both racial and male, and that was a difficult one to manage. And I think that comes back to the resources which Julie mentioned. We had to explain, yes, we acknowledge that and we would want to change the profile, but we were limited in the examiners that we could offer.
And Francois, Maria Walmsley wants to know if the patients that the students are presenting are their own patients, or are these cases that you've given them?
Thanks, that's a great question. So students self-select. So they are in the clinical environment, and this example I showed of a patient with septic arthritis of the knee, that student was involved in the initial consultation and in the care of that patient. So they self-select the patients for their panel. Each of the departments gives some guidelines. So internal medicine would say you need at least one infectious disease patient and one with a cardiac problem as well as a respiratory disease. But otherwise, students select the patients.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to now hand over to Jill, who's looked at a similar kind of virtual assessment, patient-centered assessment. But Jill, this is much more like a traditional OSCE, is that correct? Tell us.
So we still have a big old traditional medical school that
Can I get you to introduce yourself first? Sorry, Jill, and the context. My apologies.
Sorry. Anyway, Jill Conkin, I am the Longitudinal Integrated Clerkship Coordinator at the University of Alberta this year. And we've been doing sort of the MCQ short answer type assessments online for probably 4 or 5 years. But this year we always had a formative OSCE that we brought students together for. So our year goes from August to June, February. So they had something in the middle to kind of give themselves a way of benchmarking a bit. And then we'd have a formative or a summative OSCE in late June that they were back in the city for, because they would then go on to 4th year in the city. And our students are all over the province, and from the furthest community north to the furthest community south would be about 12 or 1300 kilometers, which is about where I think Francois' crew is a little further away. Anyway, so distance is a huge issue, and small numbers in each community. So we have 2 per community, occasionally 3. And so we set out to do online OSCEs, because that's what the rotation-based clerkships do, and that was sort of expected of us, and everybody thought we were nuts. And obviously our students were a bit anxious about how this was going to work. So, and Abby can butt in here if she would like, because what we decided to do, well, and trust me, we were anxious too. Anyway, so what we did was we decided to do a 2-station formative OSCE. So the students would have the practice at it and see how it worked. And we could figure out what tech issues in the background might be. And just to sort of complete it, so we have MCQ short answer OSCEs. Our students also at the very end are expected to do a formal case presentation on a patient they've seen. And then it's open to questions from and they do it with all of their cohort and somewhere between 3 and 5 faculty members. And then they are asked questions about their case presentation. So, and that was usually one of the last things we did when they were in person, and then we'd have hors d'oeuvres and beverages and kind of congratulate each other for another successful year, but obviously that wasn't
harder
possible.
to do virtually, yeah.
Indeed. So anyway, but back to the OSCE. So I mean, everybody knows what an OSCE is, I'm assuming, and if not, they can ask a question or two. And so one of the biggest things is I wondered, oh my gosh, how would we do a physical exam? So I built a station on a joint we had never used, both to try and figure out what the station would look like, how I would do that, and then how the students would do it. They did brilliantly, and they actually enjoyed it. And we set it up, you know, sort of pretend you're in the room with someone. So we expected them to wash their hands and talk about what they were going to do and whatever. And that, I'm reminded of that from what Francois has said, is weren't quite explicit enough. So a few people missed the hand washing stuff and whatever. But then we asked for them to describe what they couldn't show on their own joint and show on their own joint what they could. And that worked well. And just for other people, we didn't go on to do this because it just seemed too short a time to figure it out. But one of our students suggested, why didn't we have them bring a teddy bear or something with them? Because that would also be a way of doing this. And I've heard since that there are other places that are doing that sort of thing. Anyway, a couple of things that we learned significantly, and I think Dale's going to speak to the nuts and bolts of the tech behind this after me, is through our anxiety, we decided in the formative session that we would have a staff member we were using Zoom and we were using breakout rooms. That we would have a staff member in each of the breakout rooms with the student and the assessor, and in the cases where there was an SP and SP. Their responsibility was to help with the timing, because there is a little clock thing you can use, but most of us don't see it very well. And also, if there were glitches, they could text the main tech person in the background, and they could also, and they did, in our formative, we had a couple of glitches with Wi-Fi, not long, but they would record when things happened and what happened. And that was the best thing we stumbled on. And, you know, it was just sort of one of those things that came up and we thought we'd try. So then this year, in a sense, we were, I would say, lucky. We had fewer students than usual in our LSC this year. So in our summative OSCE that we ran last week, that went brilliantly. And I put most of this on a wonderful woman named Catherine Stevens, who moved us from room to room. What she did, and she said this was easier, and I know Dale, you and I talked about this, so you might want to bring this up when you come, but she actually moved everybody in and out of every room. So 14 students, 8 SPs, 10 assessors, and 10 staff members. And so we would be to our assigned breakout rooms, then we would all get the move out of your breakout room and off we'd go, and it worked. It was very smooth. We also, in preparation for this, because we did have a couple of communities that had spotty Wi-Fi at times, we ensured, we talked to the internet providers. We got internet boosters for those communities ahead of time and did a few things in the background. We also planned what we would do if something went absolutely kaplooey. And we made sure at the beginning that the students understood that if in one of their OSCE stations things went bananas, that it wasn't on them, and that we would scramble in the background and get them back in. We also, and the students gave us good feedback on this piece, we actually did all 14 at the same time. And they'd have a couple of stations and then a rest in a couple of stations. And we were a little anxious about that. They loved it. And we had initially said, okay, well, when you're in the rest station, no talking, because that's what happens in the ordinary place. And the team lead for the division that I'm part of decided after the first one that it was just too uncomfortable for everybody. And she just said, if you want to talk, go ahead. They loved it. They found it was really a kind of a rest and renew. And
It's like being in the corridor outside the consulting room, kind of.
Absolutely. Anyway, yeah. So it went really well. We were really quite pleased, and we will use this now most of the time, and it will gives us the opportunity potentially to do maybe one more in the year, because we didn't have the funds to bring people together twice in the year. But this means we don't need as much to do that. Anyway, that was our experience with online OSCEs.
Fantastic. And as you've sort of already suggested in your introduction, that Dale might then tell us what was happening a bit behind the scenes. Dale, we've had something similar to this, and I'd like you to talk about your experiences, please. And Abby, please feel free to jump in if you've got things you'd like to add.
You're on mute, Dale.
Yeah, that's great that Jill's had such a positive experience, because we've done some formative learning activities in the style of OSCEs, but we haven't done any summative OSCEs yet. But we have got what we're calling a modified observed consult, because we didn't want to call it an OSCE, because we did change it significantly, coming up soon. But some of these are just some dot points on what have come up as learnings about the IT and Zoom setup, and we use Zoom as well. But I think some of these considerations go across platforms, so whether you're using Teams or Zoom or other systems. So yeah, basically, I think this first dot point, providing practice opportunities for students and including how to ask for examinations. So we did do a anaesthetics station recently in our mid-year workshop, and it was all via Zoom. And I think I've got a picture. Oh, not that one, this one. So the students had to ask the standardised patient to put their fingers in their mouth, and so they have had a little bit of practice at that. But depending on what the situation is, it might not occur to students quite so obviously how they would ask for that examination over video conference rather than in person. So I think it's worthwhile letting students have that practice for that reason, and also just to get practice of using the system and the differences between doing a Zoom type situation versus an in-person situation. One thing that we didn't do in a couple of the sessions was schedule enough time for a briefing at the start of the day, just to run through those operational issues, like how it's going to work, that you're going to be, if you're using breakout rooms, you're going to be moved into breakout rooms. So please accept that when it pops up on your screen, accept the prompt, and also that sometimes the moving of students and staff between breakout rooms can take a few minutes, so making sure you put that in the timetable is really important. The other decision to make is whether you're going to use breakout rooms like Jill spoke of, and she had one person controlling the movement of staff and students through those breakout rooms, which is, we've done that as well, and we found that very successful. But the other way you can do it is have a separate meeting or separate, virtual room for each station, which we've also done. And I think it depends on the type of activity that you're doing. If you are doing something where you're just moving single students through a set of stations, and each station has perhaps an examiner and a standardised patient and maybe a co-host, which we also recommend, then I think breakout rooms is the way to go. But you might consider using separate meetings for each station if you don't have those staff available to manage that. In which case, I know our colleagues in our metro school put it back on the students to move through the rooms. So they say, here are the stations that we're going to do today. Make sure you know which link you go to at what time. And so they do it that way because they just found they didn't have enough administration staff to push like 180 students through a group of breakout rooms. So I think, yeah, that's quite a question that you should think about quite carefully. As Jill mentioned, support staff to run the logistics, assign a co-host to each station who's a virtual usher to help with the timing, make sure people are in the right place, answer any student questions, help anyone who has a crash or gets kicked out of a room for some reason. And another thing we do is have a run sheet with phone numbers and photos of our students. So this is an example where we've got all their faces, and usually we'll put their phone numbers there too. So everyone gets a copy of that, so they know who should be coming up into their station and when.
Dale, if I can just add, our in-person office person also put up the stem, took it down, and also if there was something at, sort of 3 minutes to go that had to be revealed, they were the ones responsible. So neither the SP nor the assessor needed to do that piece.
Yeah, and that's exactly the same approach we took as well with our formative. This is where you can't quite see well enough the SP's throat down the camera. So we had someone put up this picture at the time when the student was talking about them doing a Malin-Patty score for this standardized patient. So yeah, someone shares that, and it's really helpful to have someone else do that, so the person, neither the patient, the SP or the examiner, has to concentrate on that as well as the other things that they're doing. The other tip that I've got is to use a separate online group chat for staff communication. So we use Slack, which is just a text messaging tool, or you could use Skype or something that's outside of your Zoom meeting, just so you don't accidentally message the students with something that you didn't want them to hear, or you don't want to also just accidentally put chatter in there that's distracting. Use a waiting room or the on hold features if you've got students rotating through rooms, so that you don't have someone jump in before their time and have students overlapping. And also, I think Jill answered this question: will you quarantine students in a Zoom room for the duration? Obviously, they did that, and yeah, it's interesting about the not talking because everyone would just be sitting there in silence, so that could be quite awkward. Also, recommend that you record in gallery view. So that's a setting in Zoom, which means you record both the speakers at the same time rather than just the speaker view, which we were initially doing, and then we've switched it to record in gallery view because you get a better feel for what actually occurred in the interaction. And we did do some where we used virtual backgrounds. So Lucy actually did one where we were doing some advanced communication skills around Aboriginal health. And so Lucy changed her background to be like a clinic setting. So it was clear that she was the clinician, and then our patient had some lovely artwork in the background of theirs that made it quite clear that they were the Aboriginal patient. And that works really well. The other thing that we found is some student backgrounds, it's not a bad idea to tell students to put a virtual background on, especially if they're in their bedroom and they don't have a door on their wardrobe. Yeah, and the other thing is to change your Zoom name to be your SP name, so that it's really clear who the student is talking to and they can use that name. And one thing we have a question on is shared timers. We don't have a good solution for this yet. But yeah, I think that's enough. I'll stop now.
Abby, I'm really interested in hearing your experience of the virtual intensive and your sort of mock OSCEs.
Yeah, so we've had a few different ones. So we had the advanced Indigenous communication skills with Lucy, and we also have recently had some paediatric psychiatry ones. And I think that they worked really well. Actually quite surprised at how sort of involved in the scenario you feel once it sort of starts up, and it feels very natural and easy going. And yeah, I would agree that just having the little touches, like having the name up of the SP rather than just, I don't know, some other name, is really helpful. So yeah, and the timer thing I have noticed as well would be something good to solve. But yeah, I think that for the most part, it's worked really well so far. And I'd be interested to try out using the breakout rooms a little bit more in terms of switching between the groups. And I think that worked well in our mid-year workshop where we were sort of transported between the different breakout rooms. Yeah. Thanks,
that's great. Look, I've just noticed another question on the question and answer session, asking about OSCEs like you've run already, Jill, and that people like David, you've run as well, I understand, and other schools are going to run. And how much weight we put on these standardised patient assessments versus the workplace assessments. Does anyone, and whether that's changed with COVID and having to extract students from clinical environments, does anyone want to make a comment on the OSCE versus work-based assessment ratio, Jill?
So I could. So we have weighted the assessment from the community site coordinator and preceptors. They do that together as 45%, and 45% goes towards the written, so short answer and MCQ, and so half to that of that 45% and half for the OSCE. So
David,
about 45%.
thank you. David, have you changed the ratio of work-based assessment to clinical OSCE assessment because of COVID? Tell me your experience.
Not at this stage. We're still running with what we have historically always run with. Our students who normally do their written assessments and OSCEs at the end of the phase, which is in June, we haven't been able to run those exams, so they've been deferred towards the end of the year, but we don't have any plans to change the ratio. But if come November they can't do their OSCEs, we might have to rethink that.
I think that's a really difficult thing because we're all making it up as we go along, hoping for the best and recognising that things could, we could have increased constraints over time. Katrina, we've certainly started at ARCS to think about alternates to OSCEs, and I wondered if I could ask you about the record your own interview that I think it was Dale mentioned briefly previously.
Yep, sure. So I lead the medical education team at ARCS, and I'm also a rural GP. To put in context, our longitudinal integrated clerkships, we have 41 students based in 11 rural locations, and they're in 5th year of a 6-year degree. And there are about over 160 students in total in that year group. The rest are based in metro. So we've had to adapt a number of our assessments. Our students do 5 courses over the year that align with the courses that the metro students do. And 4 of those courses had OSCEs either in the mid-year or end-of-year assessment. So for 2 of those courses, we've created what we've called a recorded mock consult to replace the OSCEs. And I think Abby alluded to this. So what we did is we asked the course coordinators to write a number of clinical scenarios similar or virtually identical to how they would write an OSCE case. And then the students select one of those cases or 2 of those cases, depending on which course they're doing and what the requirements are. They select the STEM, which is provided on our online learning platform, MyUni. And they choose a mock patient. So that could be a relative, it could be their local administrative person, it could be a fellow student. And then they provide those contact details. That person is sent the patient instructions like we would provide to an SP in an OSCE. And then the student can record the interaction. And we've had a couple submitted, so they've used Zoom, the SP that they've chosen, and the student have been in different locations. And it's worked really well. So they do it like an OSCE in 8 minutes. But obviously it's different in that the information's not confidential like an OSCE is. And so to enhance the process, we decided that we would ask the students to do a self-reflection on the process as well, to help them to improve or identify learning needs. And in that, we actually are asking them to identify some 2 SMART goals for their learning. These assessments, they're summative assessments that they've replaced. They're not barrier exams, so not really high stakes summative assessment, but still part of their overall grade for the subject. Some things that we found, one was that it took us much longer than we'd anticipated to put all the information together. We had several parties involved. We needed to have clinical stems reviewed, and so it did take us longer to get the information out to the students than we intended. But the students have the whole of semester 2 to get this done and submitted to our online learning platform. The other thing was, originally we said that the students could use a fellow student as an SP, and after the first person put in a request for this, we realised that actually that wasn't such a good idea, because the students would have the opportunity to see the case from the SP perspective, and that probably wasn't fair. The students were very good about that, changing the rules along the way. We had said right from the start that this was a new assessment, and that we knew that things would crop up as we went along that we hadn't thought of, and that very quickly became clear. But it does seem like the self-reflection process has been really useful. We did record a mock version of this, but I'm not sure if we've got time to show that, Lucy. Or
perhaps we might put it up as a like a little vignette. As,
that's a good idea. So yeah, we created a STEM that was not one that was being used, and then recorded one, so that would be useful for people to look at and see how it worked. I mean, Julie and Dale were both involved in this process as well. Have you got any comments?
I could jump in. I think, as always, you're learning as you're going, but having seen the one in particular that was submitted, what really impressed me was how positive the student was about the reflection exercise, because often reflection is thrown at students as, oh, do this reflection. But I think in this case, the students really enjoyed seeing them, well, this particular student commented particularly that they really valued being able to see the playback of themselves, and that from that they were able to identify areas to improve. And then they'd written that their SMART goals, and you could see they'd really thought about it, and I was impressed by that.
Thanks very much, Julie. I wondered, Abby, whether you've had a chance to do one of these yet, and any thoughts that you have?
No, I haven't got to do mine yet. I'm sorry, I'm sort of waiting, but yeah, it's really exciting. And I've had a couple of friends do it so far, and they found it good to do. And it was great because they didn't have to necessarily source someone from the town. One of my friends did one with someone who was in Mildura. So yeah, lots of flexibility there.
That's great. All right, well, we've got a few more minutes, and I just wanted to make sure that we touched on the sort of traditional written type exams as well as the clinical exams. And Dale, you've had some experience, sorry, David, I'll ask you first. You've had some experience with online, time-limited and uninvigilated examinations. Do you want to tell us about that experience?
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. I'll try and be quick because I know we don't have a lot of time left. Just to paint a bit of background, our students are scattered right across New South Wales. We have upward of 90 students doing longitudinal clerkship, and most of them are, the majority of them are in a rural setting. The New South Wales Department of Health decided that in anticipation of a COVID surge, they would offer final year medical students the opportunity to become what the term was assistants in medicine. Or AIMs or AIMS, we abbreviated to AIMS, and they wanted to hear from us which students were competent, and they wanted us to actually rank these students in an academic sense. And because the students hadn't done any written exams since June last year, we felt that the work-based assessment that they do was not on its own, it wasn't robust enough to actually rank them. So in a very short space of time, we pulled together a multiple choice exam that we offered the students online. It wasn't compulsory, but if they wanted to apply for one of these AIM positions, they had to sit and pass this exam. If they didn't want to apply for an AIM position, they could still do the exam, but they didn't have to. So we had a number of students who we knew didn't want to apply for one of these positions, but they sat the exam anyway. I think all 92 students sat it, but except for one. And so they did it remotely. It was uninvigilated. And the reason we didn't have it invigilated was because we had to do it in a very short space of time. We considered getting a proctoring service, but because of the time pressures and also because of the cost of proctoring services, we thought we would go for an uninvigilated exam. What we did was we randomized the order in which the students would see the questions when they started the exam, and we also randomized the answers. So if there were two students sitting together, they couldn't say, oh, question number 20, the answer is D, because each student would have a different order of questions and a different order of answers. So it was really interesting. We had surprisingly few technical issues. It ran quite smoothly. The outcomes were, the distribution curve was exactly as we expected. The good students did well. The students who we knew were struggling academically didn't do so well, and this is what we see every year in the normal exams. The mean score was probably slightly higher than we had in previous years from the multiple choice parts of the exams, but we weren't surprised by that. But overall, we were very pleased with the way this ran, and it gives us hope that we may be able to do something like this for summative exams. This exam didn't count towards their academic progress at all. It was purely for ranking purposes for these aim positions. But we could perhaps do something in the future with a little bit more planning and maybe some plans for invigilation.
Now, I have left this very tight, Dale, but I think that people have been also grappling with the invigilated exams, and I don't know whether you want to talk about sort of distance invigilation, and I'm not sure whether we've got whether you want a few minutes to sort of make any statements around that.
I'll try and do it in 60 seconds.
Fabulous.
Hang on.
Because I think we could spend a whole hour on this, as you know.
Yeah. So this is just a picture of our students taking their remotely, their written exams in various locations. And what we did do was trial a remote invigilation or remote monitoring or proctoring. Remote proctoring is what I think they call it in North America, with using ExamSoft. And so what that does is record the student via their webcam. They are offline, so it's not live. There's not someone sitting there watching them, but they recorded offline, and I'll get to the one I wanted to show. That's Abby getting her ID checked. So it matches your face to a photo that it has on file to make sure you've got the right student taking the right exam. And then what it does is records the student's computer screen, their mouse, their microphone and their webcam, and then runs it through some artificial intelligence and flags any incidents. And then that is reviewed by a person hired by the third-party proctoring company. And they write a little note and tell you at what time the incident occurred. So this is saying the test taker was communicating with another individual and looking off screen at 0029 and the other times that it occurred. And so you can go back and check the video and see if you think that was a breach of academic integrity. So that's how it works. It worked pretty well. All the things that were flagged were things like student is wearing a cap, student looked off screen, student was talking to themselves during the exam, like a couple of students read the question out aloud during the exam. But yeah, we've got some work to do now on moving forward with that and whether we'll use it going forward. It was a trial. It worked pretty well. I think we would use it in certain situations, but probably not as not our everyday approach.
Thank you. Thanks, Dale. So just in summary, I think today you've heard a number of ways that we have really worked hard across the LICs that are represented today to provide students with authentic clinical assessments using distance and virtual technologies. there's much more that we could talk about and plenty more to learn in this space. And what I'd like to do now is to firstly thank the group here that have contributed to this conversation, and secondly remind all of you that are watching online that we would really like you to join us now to explore this area further and to help us learn from you as we all struggle to ensure that we provide authentic, meaningful and fair assessments to our students at this time of social distancing.